Scrooge awoke in his own bedroom, but the walls and ceilings were so hung with living green that it looked like a perfect grove. Heap upon the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, immense twelfth cakes, and great bowls of punch. In an easy state there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, who raised it high to shed its light upon Scrooge as he came peeping around. "Come in, come in! I am the ghost of Christmas Present. Have you ever walked with my elder brothers?" I don't think I have. How many brothers, Spirit?" "More than 1,800. "Spirit, conduct me if you will. I went forth last night in compulsion. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. The room and its contents vanished, and they stood in the city streets upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerk's, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless the Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. "What has ever gotten into your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. And in came little Bob, the father, at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive to the fringe, and hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "Oh, as good as gold," said Bob, "and better. You know, somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting there so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped that the people saw him in church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim, another word spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, by which they soon returned in high procession. Bob said he didn't believe that he had seen such a finer goose cooked. Its tenderness, its flavor, its size, its cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with all delight, that they particularly were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows, and they just simply couldn't have enough. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Miss Cratchit left the room, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and to bring it in. Oh, what a wonderful pudding it was! All done up, Mr. Cratchit said calmly that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. The hearth swept and the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family grew around in the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff in the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and if Bob served it all with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered, then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to you all, my dears. God bless us." "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, last of all. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "Founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit. "The odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man. Nobody knows that better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," said Bob, "Christmas Day." Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it passed away, they were 10 times merrier than they were from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. The chestnuts in the jug went round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in snow, and Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, sang it indeed very well. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and as they all know, that they may have come from the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and content with the time. It was much a great surprise to Scrooge as the scene vanished to hear a hearty laugh, and it was a much greater surprise for Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the Spirit looking upon him, and looking at that same nephew with such a smile. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," said Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece. "Well, he's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dine with us. And what is the consequence? He loses a good dinner." After tea they had music, and they set about a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find something in that. The fire of questioning elicited from Wim is that he was thinking of an animal, a disagreeable animal, an animal that growled and grunted and talked sometimes and lived in London, and it wasn't a horse or a cow or a cat or a bear, and at last Fred's sister-in-law cried out, "I know what it is, Fred. It's your Uncle Scrooge." Suddenly, as they stood together in an open place, the bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw no more. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he beheld the solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. The phantom was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed his head. "Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come? Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. Will you not speak to me?" It gave no reply. The hand was pointed straight before him. "I know. Lead on, spirit." The city seemed to spring up about them as the spirit stopped inside one little knot of businessmen. Scrooge advanced and listened to the talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know. I know only that he's dead." "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman. Scrooge was first inclined to be surprised that the spirit would attach importance to this conversation so trivial. They left this busy scene and went to an obscure part of town, a low shop where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. A gray-haired rascal of great age sat smoking his pipe. "What do you call these? Bed curtains? His blankets?" "They'd have wasted it by dressing him in it if it hadn't been for me." Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. "Spirit, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way. Merciful heavens, what is this?" The scene had changed. The ghost conducted him to poor Bob Cratchit's house, and found the mother and the children seated. Quiet, very quiet. The little noisy Cratchits were still as statues. And he took the child and set him in the midst of them. Whereas Scrooge heard those words, he hadn't dreamed them. One of the boys must have read them as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. The mother laid down her work, and put her hands to her face. "The color hits my eyes," she said. "I wouldn't have weak eyes to your father when he comes home. It must be near his time." "Past it, rather," Peter answered. "But I think he has walked a little slower than he used to these last evenings, Mother. I have known him to walk. I've known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, fast indeed." "So have I," said Peter, "often. But he was very light to carry, and your father loved him so, and he was no trouble. And there's your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter, he had no need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready on the hob, and they all tried who should help him if most. When the two children got near his knees and laid each child upon a cheek, it was as if to say, "Don't mind, Father, don't be grieved." Bob was cheerful and spoke pleasantly to his family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today, then, Robert?" "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. You would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you see it often?" "I promised him that I would walk there on Sunday. My little child, my little child." He broke down at once. He couldn't help it. The gross of Christmas yet to come conveyed him to a dismal, wretched, ruinous churchyard. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. "Before I draw near, answer me this question. Are these the shadows of things that will be? Are these the shadows of things that may be only?" Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which he stood. "Men's courses will shadow for certain events." Scrooge, trembling as he went, followed the finger and read upon the stone neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Oh, no, Spirit, no, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will honor Christmas in my heart, and I will keep it all the year." Holding his hands, he saw an alteration in the phantom's dress and hood. It shrank and collapsed and dwindled down to a bedpost. Yes, it was his bedpost. It was his own. His bed was his own. His room was his own. Blessed and happiest of all, the time before him was his own, to make amends with. He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it, and he put out his head. "What's today?" cried Scrooge, calling down to a boy. "Today? Why, it's Christmas Day." "It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it." "Do you know the poultiers in the next street by the one at the corner?" "I should hope I did." An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. "Do you know whether they sold the prize turkey that was hanging there? Go and buy it and tell him to bring it here. Come back in 5 minutes and I'll give you half a crown." The boy was off like a shot. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He won't know when he sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim." In the afternoon, he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times, and then he made a dash, and he had the courage to go up and knock. "Is your master home, my dear?" said Scrooge to the girl. "Oh, nice girl, very." "He's in the dining room, sir, along with mistress." "He knows me," said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining room. "I'll go in there, my dear." "Why, bless my soul!" cried Fred. "Who's that?" It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" As dawn rises suddenly over a high peak, Fred smiled. A wide, happy smile, unable to rest itself upon his face, but spread warmth across the room. No less warm was the loving hand of his wife upon Scrooge's arm. "Let him in. It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early in his office. Next morning, he was there. He would only be there first to catch Bob Cratchit coming in late. And he did it. Bob was there a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time." "You are? Step this way, if you please." "It's only once a year, sir. I'll be not repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday." "Now I'll tell you what, my friend. I am not going to stand for this any longer, and therefore I am going to raise your salary." "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge, with an earnestness that could not be mistaken, as they sat down. "We will discuss your affairs this afternoon over a bowl of smoking bishop. Make way up with the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend and as good a master and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, borough, in the good old world. Some people laughed at him to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good in which some people did not have their fill of laughter at the outset. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if anyone alive possesses such a knowledge. May that truly be said of us, and of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.